Ford built tanks for the Nazis, and the Nazis used those tanks to gun down lots of soldiers in the U.S. Army ranks. Yes, Henry Ford was a fascist, and a nasty one was he. He built tanks for anyone for the proper fee. Henry Ford spoke to his lackeys, and he said, "Isn't this great? We'll attack our enemies and we'll retaliate." Yes, Henry Ford was a fascist and a cunning liar too. A brown shirt with a swastika draped in red, white, and blue. Henry Ford spoke to his workers and he said, "You dare not strike. You must be patriotic and take on my Third Reich." Yes, Henry Ford was a fascist and he had not a care about the dying soldiers that made him a billionaire.
Some songwriters, they yearn for a mantle. They strive for the political mark. There is this legacy. The writers of the topical lyric, the song of social and ideological significance, the anthem for changing times, the singer who comes to your town and knows your specific struggle, be it in the factory, the mine, the ballot box, the streets. It is a light to which some songwriters are drawn, powering their wings to get close, to soak in that illumination, to carry some fuel to a struggle, to call upon justice in the name of the few, in the name of the many, and enter that lineage, one that goes back decades and longer, to rank among the sons and daughters of revolution, of the revolutionary, of the meaningful, of the mighty, the Guthries, the Seegers, the Dylans, although that is a complicated chapter, the Oaks, and the punks, and the post-punk electrifiers, the giant choruses of the Strummers and the Bonos and the Garretts, the list of legends that have held guitars, or otherwise, stood before a microphone, or not, and sang a truth into the air. What we mean when we say we want to be counted among writers of the political is maybe we want to be recognized for spending our bars, our measures, on words that reference events that matter to the many, that summon the issues of the people and places and situations as they stand in the shadow of organizations, of the institutions and the systems, to penetrate that darkness with a kind of light, and in piercing that veil, let in another light. It seems a noble occupation. It is also fraught. In the late 1990s, there was a singer who stood forward, stood up, stood in a different spot from their peers, lyrically speaking, and when he sang a song, it was indeed specific. His lyrics are accounts of incidents and arguments, assumptions and errors, reconfigurations of the news you might have been fed or the received wisdom perhaps you were carrying. David Rovich's songs moved musically in the way of great protesters, of great singers, of great poets for cause, the Seegers and the Guthries, Baez, Early Dylan, the Ann Feeneys, the Alex Olsons, and it was singular to an extent in an era when the guitar and the voice were often mostly focused on the diaristic, on the personal, on the individually profound. This could be a judgment, but it is fairly said, an observation, and broadly speaking, it's accurate. David Rovics was willing to put himself on the line, and especially in my 20s, when I first heard him, I was drawn to the line at which he stood. I first heard David play in the early 2000s, as with many of my experiences in that time, it was at Club Passim in Harvard Square in Cambridge, which all seemed appropriate, given the legacy of writers and singers that had come through that little venue since at least the 1960s. Eventually, I'd open for David and try to stay close to the kind of music he made, although it was never quite going to be the kind of music I would make. But the energy and the power of the song that was meant to some extent to be given to the people and carried forward as a rallying point for a specific exterior purpose, I wanted to be in that light, or close to it. I finally had a chance to talk with David Rovics all these years later. What I discovered and what fills the next 2 episodes of this show is an artist still at work on the specific and the topical and the positively protest-oriented, but I also found a person deeply embroiled in the new tides of the present. David Rovics doesn't tour the U.S. anymore. We will ask why. We will find out the reason, at least one of them. Our conversation in the 2 parts that follow begins with the biographical and then moves through a number of powerful chapters until it comes to the present, and in the present, our story finds us in times of trouble, but you knew that. Our story finds us in troubling and divisive times, and in getting that story, I have also taken a journey into what this storytelling means, what this kind of storytelling means, and what it can and maybe should do. Exploring the story that David Rovics has to tell has made me deeply aware of the consequences that come with our pursuit of certain kinds of light, and the consequences that can come with holding a megaphone, the consequences that arise when we make noise, when we broadcast, when we say we stand in and maybe we shine a light. And so this is the story of protest and of being protested, and it is a story of minds and souls that are searching for the paths that navigate between those poles while staying in the light, and if we are lucky enough, offering some guidance, some pinprick of illumination to others. Hi, I'm James O'Brien, and this is my podcast. This is All Your Days.
Markets, I've seen you in the streets and at your political conventions, talking of your crusade, talking of your nation, and other things too terrible to mention. And you proclaim your Christianity, you proclaim your love of God, you talk of apple pie and mom. I just got one question and I want an answer. Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Maybe Jesus would bomb the Syrians, 'cause they're not Jews like him. Maybe Jesus would bomb the Afghans.
We moved to Wilton when I was like 2.5, so I guess it would have been like 1970. And so I mean, at that time, I don't really know what the politics of Wilton were like in the early 20th century. But definitely from the mid 20th century to the present, it's a very Republican town, in the sense of not in the sense necessarily of like socially conservative so much as what they would call fiscally conservative, or the Northeast Republicans. These are pro-choice largely, I imagine. In terms of a lot of things that in terms of culture war politics, they don't necessarily fit the conservative mold, but definitely in terms of neoliberalism, they do. I mean, it's just like in the town I grew up in, most of the people worked in Manhattan in big buildings and for banks and insurance companies and stuff like that, and most of the traffic was nice cars on their way to the New Haven train station where they could get to Manhattan. So even the well-off commuters in that part of the world take trains.
How did young David Rovics burn off a Saturday afternoon in, let's say, 10 years down the road? Now you're about 12 or 13. You have a family that's steeped in music, I think. And maybe you already were, or maybe you were doing something radically different the way preteens do in the face of their parents. How did you kill a weekend when you were growing up in Wilton and you were about that age?
Well, my parents are both classical musicians, and my dad taught Long Island University composition and theory, and my mom taught private students mostly for most of my life. So yeah, I was definitely playing music. I was playing the cello at that age, although I was also kind of like had a conflicted relationship around the whole thing because I was also really kind of an anti-authoritarian type of kid, and I didn't do well with my mother's notions of how you should practice and how much influence she should have in the process. And there were those kinds of conflicts around, I guess, parenting styles and the sorts of reactions kids tend to have towards kinds of parenting styles. They're kind of more like you do what I say kind of thing. It didn't go over well with me. It doesn't tend to go over with kids very well generally. So I stopped playing the cello as a teenager and got into music again, sort of on my own terms, just a few years later, basically. But when I was 12, I was obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons and video games. And so I was basically on a weekend, I would guarantee either be with a bunch of friends playing Dungeons and Dragons and barely sleeping or eating all weekend, or I would be at the nearest video arcade, having gotten there by bicycle, or I'd be on a long bike ride because everywhere was a long bike ride away. So I got a lot of exercise, not because I was I enjoyed bicycling, but I wasn't like, it was just very practical because there was no other way to get around. Everything was far, far too distant for walking, and there were no buses.
I mean, that's the template for the times, right? Like that whole description of being a 12 to X-teen-year-old young person in the suburbs of New England. It was for a lot of kids. It was D&D and coin-op games. And do you remember? I'm interested in what playing the cello is a heavy instrument to start a story with, and it's one that requires definitely a kind of physical commitment to gain the strength and the dexterity to play it. You definitely had to have a dexterity of 17 if you wanted to play the cello. But do you remember a moment when you first made something happen with a musical instrument? And not only did someone say, "Hey, David, that's not too bad," but maybe you also felt like, "Hey, David, that's not too bad."
Oh yeah, definitely. When I first, I really thought that a lot of the exercises that we did were really cool, and I was kind of put off by the notion that these were like exercise books because, as far as I was concerned, these riffs. A lot of these riffs that you do for your exercises are like basically really cool heavy metal kind of riffs that you would do if you were playing in a metal band, and people would think that's really cool. But if you're a classical cellist, then they're just exercises that nobody's supposed to be especially impressed by. But then I discovered somewhere along the line, I guess my cello teacher introduced me to Bach's suites for solo cello, and I didn't think they were actually particularly more interesting than Dotzauer's exercises, but people recognized them, and people sort of then when you played those pieces well, then people these were pieces people had heard before, and so there was recognition, and there was like they could tell you were playing them well because they'd heard them before. So that's probably the first time I got serious praise from. Just general random people who just thought that I was a good player. I sounded good by the time I was doing those Bach pieces. I had good intonation and tone and stuff like that. Although I never learned to sight read, and I was really not a very good student in that sense, but I could play well.
One of the things I've read that you've said in an interview that this makes me think of is that there was a period of time where you just decided, and this is much later in your life, I think, or somewhat later in your life, maybe you're in your 20s by the time you get here, and that teenagers picked up a guitar at some point. I take it the guitar was maybe the next instrument. The return to the strings was on the fretboard of a guitar.
Bass guitar, actually, but I quickly drifted towards guitar for practical reasons, because they were small and comparatively, and you could carry them around. You didn't need to plug them in.
One of the things that I've read that you've said about the guitar in your hands was that at a certain point you just took hours and hours and hours to woodshed and really learn the tradition. This was now a person whose mind was turning to the kind of songs that we would have been listening to from a speaker on a record player, from a Pete Seeger or anyone else, a Joan Baez, a Utah Phillips. It doesn't matter who,
yep.
Or maybe it does matter who. But that discipline sounds like it was a part of even the young David Rovics, the ability to recognize some sort of pleasure response, some sort of hit from doing something hard over and over again, and that maybe that was even more interesting, as you said, than the composed piece. Is there a part of your personality that's just a dogged pursuer of that kind of discipline and that kind of rigorous self-training?
That's an interesting question, because I have no idea whether there is what the answer is, but I do know that I was raised by musicians who I heard practicing all the time. And my mother, both my parents are world-class pianists, and they both just play obsessively for hours every day, regardless of whether they have any, supposed reason to do so. Although, for a lot of classical musicians, their sort of justification for spending hours a day playing music is that they're preparing for their next concert. So and they usually had some kind of a concert to be preparing for. I didn't even figure that out until later in life. I just thought they just all played for 4 or 5 hours a day because that's what they did. But so, I definitely understood very well how you get good at something. And I also, I knew I wasn't, I might have a lot of sort of unrealistic fantasies in general in life, but at least as far as getting good at playing an instrument, I knew that this was something that required a lot of work, and I wasn't necessarily. I remember being very vividly being like 18 or 19 or 20 or whatever age I was, somewhere around then, when I decided actually I really want to play music. And make this my, profession in some sense. And I realized what I wanted to do and how it was going to require a lot of work to get good at it. And I knew that it was something that you could get good at if you worked at it, or at least I assumed that was the case. I learned various tricks about how to really get good at various things along the way. But I think my attitude at the beginning is still a good one, that you basically can get good at something if you work hard at it. And I think I would add, work hard in the right ways. But at least as far as technically playing an instrument, I had a good background for knowing how to work hard at something and knowing how to work hard at something in the right ways as far as playing an instrument goes. Mm-hmm. As far as songwriting, that's another thing, but it's very closely related. It is one of those things that you get good at by working at it, although I think especially with songwriting, there may be various insights that, that are especially useful that I discovered along the way that don't just have to do with hard work. But that definitely, I knew I needed to do a lot of hard work, and I set about to do that pretty methodically, and it happened to coincide with, and it was not entirely coincidental either, but I got carpal tunnel syndrome from typing too much, and I realized okay, this is just ridiculous way to waste my hands and wrists, doing this work I don't enjoy, and then getting physically injured from doing it, So I just, at that point, decided I was going to just play music, even if it didn't pay as well as, various kinds of work I could do on a computer that involved too much typing. And so when I decided to to really work on music in a really serious way at that point. It also coincided with having been injured, and also coincided with getting unemployment checks every month for a year and a half. So I was just being supported by unemployment checks and spending all my time woodshedding. And when the checks ran out, I started busking.
Go to sleep, you weary hobo. Let the towns drift slowly by. Can't you hear those steel rails humming? That's the hobo's lullaby. Don't you worry about tomorrow. Let tomorrow come and go. Tonight you're in a nice warm boxcar, safe from all that wind and snow. Go to sleep, you weary hobo. Go to sleep, you weary hobo. Let the towns drift slowly by. Can't you hear those steel rails? Can't you hear those steel rails humming?
We talked a little bit about the household of rigorous musical practitioners. And at a certain point, and for a certain set of reasons, you were like, no way, I'll see you in a couple of years and I'll be playing the guitar. I'm not going to be a cello player. Thank you very much. But then you've also mentioned something that I was aware of, and that is that you also made a rejection at some point in the next phase of formal, structured, practice-oriented life, which is college. And people pick colleges for all kinds of reasons, or no real good reason at all, maybe in my case. And you picked one that was definitely, I think, liberal. It was also a Quaker institution. It was founded by the Friends, and you could get a BA in peace studies and conflict resolution there. Maybe conflict revolution is part of that too. But then you also dropped out. So who was this person at this time making what seems to me a certain kind of choice, and then an explicit rejection of that choice somewhere into it? What was going on there?
My girlfriend at the time when I was in college there is now the director of the Peace Studies department at Earlham. And she's also a really good drummer, although I have no idea if she still plays music these days. But I went to Earlham for the one slightly more than a year that I attended. It was a fascinating experience that I have lots of fond memories of. But the only reason I went there was because my mother's a Quaker, and she applied to the school basically sort of walked me through the application process when I was a drug-addled teenager, and I got accepted. And despite my bad grade average, I have no idea why they accepted me. Probably because my mom's a Quaker, and they thought, okay, what the heck? I don't know what they're. It's the only college I applied to, so you can see that how much academic aspiration I was experiencing at the end of high school, which is not much at all. But I didn't have another plan in particular when I was 18, so it was easy enough to sort of lead me in the direction of going to college. And I really had no idea what kind of college I wanted to go to at the time. But my mom's idea that a small liberal arts college might be nicer than a big state institution, I really had no idea. I could have been easily convinced in the other direction, I'm sure, but her reasoning sounded good, and she had gone to a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, Oberlin, and I thought that sounds like a fine idea. So, and I had a good time there. I just, but academically, I was just not up for it, and I wanted to play music, and I also couldn't keep up with the reading, and I didn't realize until after I dropped out that most people don't keep up with the reading. I thought that actually that people were doing that, and I was just really inadequate and just couldn't. I mean, I never learned how to study. I was a bad student in high school. I was bored, had no interest in school. Somehow graduated because I attended classes for the most part, And but I never learned how to study or how to read fast or a lot of the other skills that could have been useful to have before actually going to college.
Your mom was Your mom was a force. I mean, she was. Seems like she had a very developed vision that maybe she wished to participate in, but that it was developed in ways that had to do with big ideas like classical music and a liberal education at a Quaker school. If she's still with us, is she still a big force? Does she still have a very developed vision for David Rovics, or has she come to know you in a different way in this point?
Yeah, she's still with us, and she, I mean, she's always been really supportive of directions that I took in life, and of course, you know, I ended up being a professional musician. So even if it's not classical music, you know, it's I in many ways did not fall very far from the tree. And also, you know, although I would, you know, I would, as I've mentioned, you know, I have some issues with some of her, you know, and, you know, many others, people in the world and in her generation in particular, certain parenting styles that I have tried to not adopt myself as a parent. But her politics were and are really interesting, and she's I mean, she's a brilliant musician and had a lot of positive influence on me and others, and certainly politically, you know, I never really thought about it until decades later, but I was exposed to a lot of the politics that I later sort of got more developed in my sort of the analysis and later, but my first exposure to the anti-nuclear movement, to the idea of the anti-nuclear weapons movement, anti-nuclear power movement, the idea of being a vegetarian, you know, a whole lot of other ideas that were very influential for me as a young person. I was first exposed to because of my mom. And also like the mailing list she was on, you know, just like the stuff that came in the mail, you know, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Like even just, like stuff from, you know, the anti-nuclear movement and from, you know, the vegetarian groups. And, you know, I don't know. I just, at the time, it just seemed this is just stuff that came in the mail. It didn't occur to me at that time that, you know, everybody else doesn't get the same anti-nuclear stuff in the mail every other day. You know, this is because she's subscribed to these things, you know.
In a certain sense, the male person was bringing you your future. You just didn't know it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What kind of music were you playing when you were at Earlham?
I was so I had gotten into in my teens. I got way into LSD and psychedelic music of all kinds, and especially psychedelic rock from the late '60s, especially the Grateful Dead. And so at that time I was just playing a lot of improvisational sort of rock and roll kind of stuff with other musicians. And when I was just playing the guitar by myself, I was just playing improvisational acoustic guitar kind of stuff that sounded vaguely like rock and roll, and increasingly got influenced by the same kinds of influences that the Dead had, you know, the Appalachian music and Irish music, and so I got into that, and then went off in different directions. Discovered singer-songwriters who wrote politically charged material somewhere around, I guess. I mean, I first was exposed to Pete Seeger at a very young age, but then as in my late teens, I was exposed to somewhat more contemporary types of artists like Phil Oakes. I mean, not that contemporary, but, you know, and dead by then. But and then other much more contemporary artists like Jim Page and various others that I discovered this whole tradition as a young, when I was still in my late teens. And but when I was at Earlham, it was I hadn't discovered those guys yet. I was basically playing psychedelic rock.
In the 24th century, everything is peachy keen. Everybody has enough. The replicators replicate all kinds of cool stuff. You can wander all across the universe, No quadrant is too far off to traverse. Exploration is humanity's highest goal. They've discovered all kinds of planets, yeah, they're really on a roll. How can we get there from here? We've lost our way, I fear. Oh, Captain, won't you show us where to go? Make it so, make it so, oh, make it so. In the 24th century, men and women live in harmony. There's peace and justice with...
There was not a straight line between psychedelic rock and songs about stealing a kiss behind the barricades for David Rovics. If you listen to him early on, say this first song on his first record, Make It So, you had to go along with a conceit, with the filky nature of the lyric, filky, that filk, that often ill-advised blending of folk music constructions with science fiction themes. But if you listen closely to the work to Make It So, and you look carefully at what's happening in the lyrics that it offers about humanity, hope, reformation, and frustration, you see, yes, the shackles of youth, but you see that they are loosening. There are places and moments and situations that are our crucibles. In them, we melt, and if we are lucky, we are reformed. Biography and history, however, seldom conform to the storyteller's wishes. This is true. It is also true that the young David Rovics arrived in a place that had become a magnet for the minds that sought the distinction of committing to action, to activism, response to and rejection of given systems. Berkeley, a place for maybe carving out a way of living with a wealth of practitioners from whom an applicant could learn. David steps into this scene in the late 1980s. The progressives have become the dominant voice within the community of Democrats there, and the city is a seat of environmental and food culture thinking, along with its long history of civic unrest and activism dating back to the 1960s. Tell me about how you got there, the time you spent there, what you played there. I think you become a union thinking person while you're there. It seems like it was a crucible of some sort that brings a bunch of the things we've talked about. Those mailed flyers that kept coming to your house, your experiences with music and the voices of certain singers who had a political sensibility. Am I right in thinking that Berkeley's sort of where you melt down and get reconstituted as something closer to what David Rovics would be going forward?
Maybe. I mean, there's all these elements that date back to my early childhood. These influences, like, you know, left-wing political influences, like my mother, and like the elementary school I went to, and like the camp I went to in junior high. So there's a lot of these influences go way back, but they were definitely in many ways solidified in Berkeley, for sure. And Berkeley was also the first city I ever lived in. Really, I mean. You know, not counting the post-industrial abandoned town of Richmond, Indiana, where Earlham College was located, and the college was very separate from the town. But the first city I really lived in was Berkeley, and I really went there just because an old camp counselor had a place there, and had invited me to visit. So that was my main justification for going to Berkeley, other than that I was generally interested in the Bay Area and had heard a lot about over the years about both the cultural, I mean, most of my favorite bands were from the Bay Area, and definitely the political upheavals that the Bay Area has been noted for a long time were things that I was at least somewhat aware of. Certainly in the 60s, as far as what went on there in the 60s, I was aware that it was a hotbed of all kinds of social movement activity, both sort of left politics as well as hippie counterculture kind of cultural renaissance stuff. So I was definitely interested in all of that, but the reason why I ended up in Berkeley rather than San Francisco or Santa Cruz or any number of other places around there is just because I knew somebody there when I first went. But Berkeley was a great place to end up, and I mean, yeah, I don't know really how much my politics or thinking or music was particularly developed by the 9 months I spent living in Berkeley in the late 80s, but it certainly was. I was only there for 9 months, and then when I try to even remember what I was doing in my 20s, and it's such a blur because I was just so constantly like living somewhere for like 9 months, and then basically a couple of deadheads I knew were driving across the country to Atlanta, and that was and they needed an extra driver, and I didn't need to pay for gas, so that was the whole reason I left.
So it was Atlanta, and at some point between Atlanta and the return to California, you land in my hometown, and you're in Boston in the early 90s. I know a little bit about Boston in the early 90s, and that I was just at that age then where I was going to college in Framingham. I'm aware of Central Square. I'm certainly aware of Harvard Square. I definitely know the Pit in Harvard Square. I definitely understand, that there are buskers and performers. This is about the time that I think people like Chris Chandler are knocking around in the same area, Lee Kidd and other people. But who did you know, and what were your circles, and what was that about when you get to Boston and the guitar and the song becomes something that I think you're doing a lot now in the subways, making some you can make good change in the subways. And so what was that about? Who was that person?
Well, that was, I was in the late 80s and early 90s, sort of on and off in between living in Berkeley and San Francisco and Seattle. I was living in Boston. So I was often bouncing across the country, looking back in what seems very random ways, but must have made some more sense at the time. I really basically just wanted to see the world, and I wanted to travel, and I wanted to see lots of different places, and I never felt quite brave enough to travel the way some people do with like no money in a backpack. I wanted to have jobs and running water and electricity and a bed to sleep in and, that kind of thing. So I tended to travel more slowly, like basically, staying somewhere for 9 months, but that kind of thing. So, and of course, always promising people that I was moving in with that I was going to stay more than a year, and probably never even having the intention of doing that in the first place, so I feel kind of bad about some of my housemates that I left on. I don't think I ever, didn't pay the last month's rent or anything, but I certainly stayed shorter than I, would have, probably told them I was planning to. But I was, so in the late 80s and early 90s, I was working temp jobs and living in the Boston area a lot, and hanging out with a lot of musicians and listening to a lot of music and playing music. So I had friends like Chris Chandler, who took me to the first People's Music Network gathering that I had ever been to, which I believe was in 1990. And I knew various other people who were playing music in the streets, and I hung out with a couple of Berkeley students a lot and played a lot around Berkeley College of Music. And then, but it was then when I moved back to Boston after once again living on the West Coast for quite a while, moved back to Boston in the mid 90s. I think I was there in the mid 90s from around 94 or so for 3 years, where I was busking full time. And who I was at that time was, basically I was still woodshedding. I was still trying to become a really good musician, and I knew that the Boston subways were a great place to do that, because unlike most anywhere else in the country, in Boston you can play with amplification. So then that gives you the opportunity to really practice the way you would be practicing to play in front of an audience in a club or something, because what happens with a lot of buskers in places where you cannot use amplification is you develop a style that really only works for busking, and it tends to be very loud and lacking in dynamics. Mm-hmm. And it's it really doesn't translate well to another kind of quieter environment. But if you got a sound system, then you don't have to have that problem. And so I was intentionally doing obscure songs by the likes of Jim Page and Phil Oakes and Utah Phillips, and because those were the songs I wanted to be good at playing and come up with really good musical renditions of these songs and cool guitar parts to these songs. And my idea was to do them at least as well or better than the artists who wrote them, and come up with really interesting renditions of their songs. And I was doing that intentionally because I believe, actually, because Utah, I don't know if it was in a recording or if he told me this, because I can't remember, but I think it was a recording, because I don't think I had met him yet. But he said, if you want to be a good songwriter, you should learn several hundred songs that other people wrote first, and I think he's only one of many people who have said such things, and it's great advice, and it's absolutely great advice, and that's what I was setting out to do, to just memorize several hundred songs that other people wrote, and during that time I was also writing songs, which I was not singing in public, for the most part, because I had realized that the songs that I was writing in the late 80s and early 90s all sucked. And it was all just part of the growing process, I guess. And maybe eventually I would have started writing good songs. But and there were some lines that were just good. There was occasionally verses that were good in so the stuff I was writing in the late 80s and early 90s. But what I realized at some point, specifically what I realized in May of 1993, was that this stuff was too preachy, and I was telling people what to think, and I was telling people what to feel, and I was really stuck in a box of my own creation, thinking of myself as a particular type of person from a particular type of place, class, race, gender, all that stuff. Yeah, I had myself in a impossibly constricted box from which to try to communicate, and it doesn't work. I discovered if you want to communicate well and write good songs, as I started writing in 1993. I think I can say objectively, I started writing good songs back then. There are objective ways to tell whether a song is good, and if you write a sad song and a room full of people starts crying, that's a very good sign that you have succeeded in writing a sad song. So I started getting that kind of feedback and realizing that I was on the right track, but I knew I had a lot of more work to do. So I was actually just working on other people's songs while I was also working on creating a sort of a body of original work that I could be proud of, which I had. And I had pretty much thrown out everything I had written before '93 when my housemate and close friend Eric Mark was killed on the night of before May 1st in 1993 in San Francisco, and that was a seminal moment of anything that's ever happened to me. I mean, that was the moment that transformed my thinking and my relationship with myself and with the world around me. And with my abilities as an artist.
Every time I see that street, I think of you. And I think of the mornings, your long red hair. You're rolling out of bed, though you'd rather stay right there. But your housemates are up, and there's so much to do. Every time I see that street, I think of you. And I think of the afternoons, lost together in thought. Our long walks in the park, all the answers we sought, with a mind and a heart of the wondrous few. And every time I see that street, I think of you. And I think of the evenings, all the stories you told, out driving your cab, barely 20 years old, but with such ancient eyes, oh, the wisdom you knew. And every time I see that street, I think of you. And I remember that night, the tequila we drank, laughing for hours, with the world to thank. And you told me you loved me, and I said, Eric, I love you too. And every time I see that street, I think of you.
There was a gang war underway in San Francisco in 1993. David and 3 friends, including a young man named Eric Mark, had gone to the Mission District in that city late that night to spray paint an abandoned building with Workers' Party slogans. Eric and one of the other friends, who happened to be Mexican, kept watch for the police. Eric and his compatriot ascended 3 stories to do the work. A car of young people pulled up. One wielded a gun. They robbed Eric and the other man, but then they did not leave. The kid with the gun began to harass the Mexican of the pair, at whom he pointed the gun. Eric tried to intervene. The young man shot him, dead. David, still standing, up above. I have 2 questions. I was going to ask you about mentors and triggers and transformations, but you've taken me right into the heart of it. Can you tell me a little bit more about Eric and a little bit more about the role that was replaced by a hole because of what happened? Was this a mentor in the sense of, was Eric a teacher to you in some way, or was this just I have no idea. There may be many reasons, and there may be probably many layered reasons, but take me further into the part that wasn't there anymore once this happened.
Well, I mean, time. When I take myself back to me being, I guess, 26, and Eric was 25, I think, and we were housemates on McAllister Street in San Francisco, and we had met because we were mutual friends with a couple of folks who lived at the house there, who I had known for years, and Eric had met and become their housemate. And then when I moved back to San Francisco, I became housemates of theirs again, and became friends with Eric as a result of being housemates with him. But we became very good friends, and he was he was a dynamic, extremely intelligent, full of empathy, adventurous, crazy adventurous, like in ways that I didn't share. Like he rode a Ducati way too fast and weaved through San Francisco traffic in ways that just made you think this guy's going to get himself killed any minute. And I mean, I rode on the back of his motorcycle once and vowed never to do it again because I had too much. It was terrifying. But so he was a real thrill seeker, and he had a degree in mechanical engineering. He was working for the city of Berkeley as a mechanical engineer, and he quit his job and became a cab driver in San Francisco in order to have more interesting life experiences. You know, that's Eric.
long before dawn, determined to wander till the darkness was gone. San Francisco at night, and the warm summer breeze, walking back alleys, just as free as you please. And I think of those poor boys who drove up to say, give us your money, and they blew you away with one pull of a trigger. Your sweet life was through, and every time I see that street, I think of you.
I mean, it was just a completely transformational experience. And the reason, I mean, the grief was the trigger for the transformation, but what the grief triggered, which is, I think, something that many, many other people have experienced who have experienced such traumas, is the grief triggered in kind of related to what LSD does to your brain. It was like I couldn't put myself in a box anymore. You know how when you do acid, you're not thinking about who you are in the sense of like, there's all these ideas you have of, I'm looking out the window at a tree and there's a car, and you can put these things in sensible boxes. How we view the world around us, we have everything put in a box, pre-arranged, so we don't have to think about anything we're looking at. If it's something that we see on a regular basis. So if you see something that's not something you see on a regular basis, like there's a Martian walking down the sidewalk, well, then you have to, wait a second, I've never seen a Martian before, so what is that? And then it gets you thinking about what you're looking at, that you're no longer taking it all for granted. But much the same way that psychedelics do that kind of thing to your brain, what I discovered in the intense trauma of losing a friend to a violent death like that, what it did for me was suddenly I viscerally related to everybody else who had that experience, and I could tell that I was surrounded by them. And it was like, because once you've had this experience, you see it in somebody's face if they've had that experience. And I was in the Mission District in San Francisco, which is populated at that time. Now it's completely changed. But at that time, it was mostly populated by refugees from Guatemala and El Salvador. So it was just obvious that, to me walking around there, that I was surrounded by other people who had identical experiences to what I had just experienced. The difference being they had probably had them more, and it probably involved family members, but it's the same kind of thing, this kind of grief that then breaks down your ability to put yourself in a box, and what that does artistically, I discovered, is it allows you to communicate as a human being to other human beings without having to worry about boxes, So as you can imagine, I have despised identity politics ever since.
If I die tomorrow, maybe in a speeding car, I like to travel with my notebook and guitar. There's too many cars out there, not enough train tracks. I tried flapping my wings, but I just don't have the knack. Don't talk to me of accidents in this great democracy. America will be the death of me.
If I die tomorrow, my body blown apart by some child with a shotgun, raging fire in his heart. Killed in some concrete jungle war zone by some kid who never learned to write. Raised by desperation and surviving the long night in the wrong place at the wrong time in this land of opportunity. America will be the death of me. If I die tomorrow, pipe bomb beneath my seat, or from drowning in the bathtub, choking on a piece of meat, you can rest assured I did not mean to slip upon the grass. It was no one that I knew who rammed the plunger up my ass. It's just that I was told to speak freely. America will be the death of me. I may not die tomorrow, and my death will not give pause to the coroner who may say that I died of natural cause. Lungs black from breathing city air, cancer coursing through my veins. I'll be glowing in the dark from the radiation rain. So here's a toast to Uncle Sam and to mortality, and to America, which will be the death of me.
The earth spins round again. David Rovics is in Europe as this episode unfolds, and there he will play until at least the end of June. The United States won't have him on this tour. Maybe not anymore. There is more to it than this, perhaps, as David's music has moved through those digital channels that he in part employs, if not enjoys. It has been the case that his words and ideas have reached many across many channels, and in the time of the internet, there comes a price for all that movement, a price for all these conduits, this distribution, and the rooms, so to speak, in which we find ourselves because of it. In the next of this two-part series covering the work of David Rovics, The Light, that for so long was focused on the struggles and triumphs, setbacks, causes, the tribulations of people striving for fair wages and reasonable concessions, for clear boundaries and a cessation of that whistling bomb's descent, it changes yet again. The light that illuminates is also a radiation, and given its rays for long enough or in just the right places, there are mutations that follow. We'll continue our conversation with David and follow that shifting story as it strays from the original path, one of righteousness, one of indignation, to another, a path marked by hesitations and confrontations, marked by accusations and revocations and cancellations. Part 2 is next week, and our story turns to a focused and not very comforting chapter from the book of The Artists, the story of those in pursuit of the political, but in the digital age. Until then, thank you, as always, for listening. I'm James O'Brien, and this is my podcast. This is All Your Days.